To begin with, I joined the Rhodesian Air Force in 1952. I joined to do 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, I was selected from others to join the permanent force. I motored on, and in the end I had done 28 years. In 1952, and it was the second half of 52 that I joined number 3 course. When we started, we were in ground school for, I think it was a month. Then we got airborne in Tiger Moths. The Tiger was a very sensible training aircraft, if you like, because it was essentially safe, but to fly it to the best of its ability was quite a challenge. Now that leads to a story. One of the students that was on the same course as myself, at a later stage of his training in a Tiger, did a loop. And in the loop, at the top end of the loop, you would throttle back over the top. You would come down here with the throttle fully closed, and as you got to the bottom, you would open the throttle again, which he did. And the engine backfired. So the exhaust pipes were on the starboard side. When eventually, after climbing away with the power and after the backfiring and so on, when eventually he did look this side, lo and behold, this lower main plane was on fire. It was fabric covered. So his first instinct was to look around and say, oh, there's a field over there, and make an approach to make an emergency landing on that piece of ground. When I say field, it's like agricultural field, not airfield. And as he did that, so the airplane was more and more reluctant to fly because of the destruction of the lower starboard main plane. And so unfortunately for him, he had hit a tree on the way into the field and finished up, the whole thing finished up upside down. After the Tiger Moths basic flying training, which lasted roughly 5 months, say, we moved on to advanced flying training, which was on the Harvard. And then you moved on to the operational training unit, OTU. And that was based on Spitfires. And the Spitfire that we flew was the Spit 22, which obviously from its mark number you could tell was right towards the end of the Spitfire career. The number of Spits that we had steadily reduced in number because for one reason or another the aircraft would kind of give up in a certain way, and it would then be put to one side and was unusable. We finished up after a certain length of time, I think with 3 aircraft, but it might even have been as few as 2. And those 2 or 3 were air tested on a regular basis, generally speaking, on a Saturday morning, because the other type of flying was not taking place. So pilots, such as myself, were available to get these things airborne and put them through their paces and bring them back and say, yes, this is still working. So an air test, in other words. Now, on that particular Saturday, when we got back, we were given the news that headquarters had sent out a directive that those Spits were now grounded. And that was the end of the Spit, so far as we were concerned, in Africa. So that's what brought them to an end from our point of view. During the course of my training, the Air Force itself was properly formalized and created and agreed to politically and all the rest of it. And it became the Southern Rhodesian Air Force. In the course of those years, we had acquired the Canberra. And the Canberra is a fighting machine which needs a 2-man crew, a pilot and a navigator who is also a bomb aimer. Now, why did we get Canberras? Because we being the government, and therefore the Air Force itself, had a relationship to assist the RAF in the Middle East, specifically in Cyprus and also in Aden. And that assistance required obviously specialist vehicles. We didn't need the Canberra for internal security purposes, although it turned out to be very valuable in that regard later on. So to begin with, we had Spitfires descending from that same understanding that we would lend assistance to the RAF. Later on, we got Vampires for the same sort of reason, and later on again, Hunters, and at more or less the same time, Canberras. Those were acquired during the days of Federation, and they stayed on with us when the Federation broke up. But one of the early experiences which I had with 3 other people was we came to Britain here to pick up 4 Provost training aircraft from Percival in Luton. We got the aircraft from there, but we took the aircraft to RAF Benson, which is just up the road here. And we stayed at Benson for 3 or 4 days, perhaps a bit longer, I can't remember exactly how long, in order to make quite sure that the aircraft were fully operational and that sort of thing, and everything was functioning correctly, because we were going to fly them back to Africa. And the Provost is quite a challenge. To take 4 Provosts from Benson back to Salisbury and Rhodesia was quite a long-winded and, maybe hazardous, that's perhaps the wrong word, but certainly not a cakewalk. The first leg was Benson to Dijon in France. The next leg was Dijon to Marseille. The next leg was Marseille to Cagliari in Sardinia. The next leg was from Cagliari to Tunis. We flew along North Africa, from Benghazi, for example, to El Adam, over the part of the desert where a hell of a lot of fighting had taken place, to and fro, as Rommel advanced and retreated and advanced and retreated. And from the air, which was about, say, 10,000 feet above the ground, above the desert, you could see marks on the desert which were clearly left by tank operations, because you could see where they had lagered, for example, or where they had gathered for refueling. And all the desert was all messed up, which clearly you would not see if you were standing on the ground. But from 10,000 feet above, those marks were persistent enough to still be there, and we're talking, say, between 10 and 15 years after the North African campaign. And we then proceeded down the Nile, Khartoum, and eventually into the Rhodesias, or into more Central Africa, the last leg being Lusaka to Salisbury. Now, all of that must have taken us a couple of weeks at least. I could look in my logbook and find out the answer. Now, those 4 Provosts were accompanied by a Dakota, which belonged to the Air Force. It was our Dakota accompanying us, who had technicians on board and that sort of stuff. And the DAC would take off probably just after us, because the techs would see us off. The DAC would load up and follow on and get there before us. Not because we were slouching about, but because our cruising speed was slower than theirs. And I was terribly fortunate to be able to participate in that, to be selected to participate in that. So I became its instructor on the Tiger Moth and also on the Harvard at the same time. And we used to fly Tigers, say 6 o'clock in the morning until breakfast time. Then we had a break. Then we went to work with the Harvards. And by lunchtime, our day had more or less finished. And that went on for a number of months, actually, during which time more Provosts were delivered, so that eventually we dropped the Tiger Moths and started basic flying training on the Provost instead. And at more or less the same time, the Vampire had been introduced, so the flying training was from Provost to Vampire, and the Vampire was the operational airplane at the same time. So when you were on operational training, it was on the Vamp. Which reminds me to say that when we flew to Spitz, when we converted to Spitz, there was no dual Spitfire. We only had single-seaters, the 22. So the first time you actually handle the thing, you had not been airborne in a Spitfire at all. And it was a handful on the ground. The reason for that was because it had a huge amount of power, something like 2,000 horsepower, driving a 5-bladed prop and producing a whole stack of thrust. And you were airborne in short order, a few hundred yards got you airborne. So the Spit was a very exciting machine, and I think if you speak to anybody whose flying experience includes the Spit, they will have endless stories about that. And the Spit is not ideally suited for landing in the Rhodesian bush. We went to Aden because that was where we had a responsibility to back up the RAF. We went operationally to work alongside them in the mid-50s somewhere, and this was the first time we went to discharge this responsibility. So I was amongst the band of people who got there for the first time. We flew, I think the first time we went, and I was one of them, I think we flew 8 Vampires to Aden in 2 flights of 4. And the route that we took was Salisbury to begin with to Blantyre in Nyasaland. From Blantyre we went to Dar es Salaam. From Dar es Salaam we went to Mogadishu in Somalia. And from Mogadishu in Somalia to Aden itself. So 4 legs got us there.
When you were in Aden,
yeah,
I think you had to fire some shots in anger.
Yes, we did. Yes, we were there operationally, so pretty obviously. But it was a very mixed feeling that you had about this, because you'd go to the ops room before getting airborne, and you were told your target is X and your mission is Y, and X would be a little mud village somewhere at a map reference which you'd have to find your way to, and Y would be you hit house number so-and-so or house so-and-so, which looks like this. You hit it with cannon fire and or rocket fire so that you demolish it. So when you pitched up, you came out of the blue. There was no way to deliver a warning to anybody on the ground down there. You came out of the blue and you hit this thing, which from your point of view had done nobody any harm at all. But it was housing terrorists or whatever it was doing, and those terrorists had done XYZ, whatever that was, and the army had requested that they get hit between the eyes, so we did it. But you were left feeling that this is unjustified to some extent, that the death penalty is being administered to people who had been naughty. But to get to Akrotiri, we used to go, depending on where you left from, either Thornhill or Salisbury. You would go to Nairobi first. From Nairobi you would go to Khartoum. From Khartoum you would go to El Adam, which is in fact at Tobruk. And from El Adam you would go to Akrotiri in Cyprus.
Between the mid-1960s and the late 1970s, a bush war was fought with increasing intensity between Ian Douglas Smith's white minority government in Salisbury and 2 black nationalist movements, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA. Two of the worst atrocities of this war were the shooting down of two Air Rhodesia passenger planes in late 1978 and early 1979.
The Viscounts, both of them were almost identical, but the first one, a Viscount took off from Kariba late in the day, taking tourists back to Salisbury. And shortly after takeoff, it was hit by a ground-to-air missile called a Strela, which was a shoulder-fired, almost like a bazooka, fired from the shoulder, but the missile itself was heat-seeking, so you locked it onto the engine. You would track the aircraft like this, it would lock onto the engine heat, then you fired it, and it would chase after the engine heat until it hit the target.
38 of the 52 passengers and crew were killed on impact, whilst 10 of the survivors were massacred subsequently by ZIPRA terrorists.
But we went back and punched them right between the eyes very heavily, and the operation has become known across the world as Green Leader. Just outside Lusaka, they had a camp, a residential camp. We hit that camp with Canberras, with Hunters, with helicopters, with ground forces, all kinds of things. We didn't interfere at all with Zambia itself, or with Zambian forces, or with Zambian private property, or anything like that at all. We hit the terrorists right between the eyes quite vigorously. And there's been a long memory of this. Green Leader has become known all around the world, one way or another. And more or less 6 months later, they did it again.
On the 12th of February 1979, Air Rhodesia Viscount Flight 827 was shot down whilst taking off from Victoria Falls, killing all 59 passengers and crew on board. The Rhodesian government responded with Operation Vanity, a reprisal raid on a ZIPRA camp in Angola, using, among other weaponry, Canberras with 1,000-pound bombs.
Now, the people who did this were directly under control of Joshua Nkomo, which was the Matabele part of the terrorist organization, which was ostensibly fighting for universal suffrage and freedom of the people and prosperity of the people and all those good things that are wrapped up in the American Constitution. And the world said nothing. The world said nothing. And this is now the 40th anniversary, as near as damn it, as today. It's as near as damn it the 40th anniversary of both of those occurrences. And again, I would like to think that somehow the world should have its cage rattled to remind itself that they let this go by without any kind of response at all. So that it was a grim and quite unnecessary thing. I don't think it furthered the ostensible aim of either ZANLA or ZIPRA or whoever they were one iota. I'm sure it didn't further them one iota. Politically, in 1980, Lancaster House had taken place and so on, and there was a general election held, and Mugabe moved into power. So now I was in a position to retire with those benefits which I'd signed up for earlier on. And I was second in command of the Air Force, so I was looking at having to move into the command seat within about a year. So I decided, look, I can't, in all honesty, continue to serve the upcoming political regime under Robert Mugabe. I can't do it. And with Joshua Nkomo alongside him from the Matabele side of life. I said to myself, I can't give these guys an honest day's work. So the honourable thing to do is to pull out, which I did. I abandoned the country, in effect, by moving into South Africa, because I just felt it wasn't going to work. And it did work for around about 10 years. It worked very well. But all of a sudden the wheels came off when the political leverage forced Mugabe to start taking back land which had been farmed very successfully by white farmers and giving it back to the state, in effect, and kicking off the white farmer regardless of expense and regardless of the consequences. And so those people, so that caused a huge loss of confidence in the world at large about Zimbabwe and its future. And that continues up to this day. So in one sense, I was correct in my judgment, because it did come to pass that it was a political failure. But in the other sense, I was wrong, because I anticipated a collapse much sooner than actually occurred. It took 10 years before it really fell in a hole. But nevertheless, the top line is that my judgment was I could not continue to give loyal service to the new regime. So the answer was to pull out, which I did.